Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking to you. My name is Mirette. I'm a master's student at the British University in Egypt. And today, I'll be talking to you about my paper, which talks about practical steps for mitigating climate change-induced risks, a guideline for enhancing the resilience of vulnerable Egyptian coastal regions. Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through all the contents really quickly because I don't want to waste any time. So first things first, we're going to be talking about our problem, our main problem. So our problem is generally climate change risks, and it's the most defining issue of our time on a global scale, and it mandates immediate action. But when we go to the root cause of climate change, what exactly is it? We know that it's rising temperatures that lead to extreme weathers and unpredictable patterns, and maybe we're not prepared for it. We don't have the tools to yet predict it accurately. But what actually causes these rising temperatures? Well, because of human interventions and the increased carbon dioxide emissions that we have been producing because of our fossil fuel consumption and the way that we're treating the environment in general, this leads to way too much on the planet. So it could actually release it back into the earth. So that leads to an entrapment. All of this carbon dioxide, it gets trapped inside of the planet's atmosphere and it warms the oceans. And that leads to, on a specific scope, which is the problem that we're tackling, is sea level rise and coastal flooding. So the main vulnerable entity when it comes to sea level rise and coastal flooding are, of course, coastal cities. Though those have disproportionate risk and they need urgent adaptation. So naturally, flooding would lead to environmental damage, infrastructure failure, and of course, massive displacement and loss of life. But due to the rapid urbanization that we do have around our coastal regions, most of the cities and the metropolitan cities are actually resided on coastal areas. Because of that heavy development, constant development with no regards to the land itself, we have a lot of land loss, erosion, and saltwater intrusion, which actually in turn exacerbates the climate change risks. So this is a representation of the Egyptian coastal line. We have the Delta region and the Mediterranean area. This is amongst the most vulnerable areas all across the world. It is Alexandria specifically is the third most vulnerable coastal city in the world. And this is the projected coastline by 2100. It might seem far away, but it actually isn't that much. So why is action urgent? Why are we doing this? Because there are certain gaps in the adaptation efforts that we need to set and we need to tackle before we can actually start addressing these issues because they're imminent. They're coming anyways. So we need to kind of prepare for them. For instance, the Egyptian National Climate Change Strategy in 2050 was just realized in 2022, which is 3 years ago. But the National Adaptation Plan, it was set in 2011, and it still is yet to find any conclusive evaluation or monitoring results. So based on the current policies, we realize that we have a little bit of poor flood risk assessment and a lack of early warning systems, and available data for people to address the risk and to know exactly where to pinpoint it. And of course, from an architectural point of view, inadequate land use and a lot of informal settlements, especially around the medium to high flood risk zones. So the aim of this research is to develop a coastal resilience guideline that helps the mitigation of climate-induced coastal flooding and ensure that Egyptian vulnerable coastal region, particularly Alexandria, has the capacity to actually be resilient against these predicted hazards. So it integrates a bunch of strategies. You have adaptation measures, you have mitigation measures, and resilient design, and of course, policy, because without it, none of that could actually be adopted. So the objectives of the paper was to attain this aim through analyzing the climate risks, particularly, and evaluate the existing adaptation and mitigation strategies. We're going to look at other types of examples, global best practices of similar coastal regions with similar risk. And we're going to extract from them the data that is going to be necessary in order to propose practical coastal resilient guidelines, and then recommend improvements based on a priority. So the research methodology, as I just previously mentioned, is divided up into three main pillars of research. The literature review, of course, it tackles the risks and the national policies. And then we move on to the case study analysis. We have four different coastal regions: the Netherlands, the Bangladesh, Japan, and New York City. And we give them a selection criteria based on, are they low-lying areas? Are they densely populated? And of course, they have to be around some form of body of water that is prone to flooding. Have they demonstrated any form of success in their adaptation measures and strategies that they have applied, and so on? And their relevance, of course, is what they've done applicable on the Egyptian scale or not. And of course, the policy analysis so that we know what we're heading towards. And finally, that will create the guidelines for us. So as per the first pillar of research, which is the sea level rise and coastal flooding, according to NASA, from actually 2025 has been the highest of the recorded sea level rise. This is actually the chart that represents how it has been. It usually was 4.4 millimeter per year, but it has been increasing further and further due to the climate change effects. And this is the coastal flooding in 2100 that it is expected to hit Alexandria. And if we look at this map from Coastal Central, we could actually kind of work through the years and the amount of areas that are going to be prone to flooding. Back to this. Sorry, I can't move this for some reason. Okay, so what about adaptation and mitigation? Are they the same thing? We hear them a lot, especially when we're talking about climate action. We hear the words adaptation, mitigation, sustainability, but is there a difference between them? And the answer is actually yes. Adaptation practices and mitigation practices are both under the umbrella of climate change action. However, adaptation can be separated into four main pillars. We can talk about adaptation from an architectural or urban planning point of view in a sense of engineering. So you can construct seawalls and you can upgrade your drainage systems and you can do all of these structural defenses that could mitigate the effects of the flood risk. However, there's another type, which is actually using the urban environment as it is, but the natural urban environment, and it's known as natural-based solutions, or NBS, which is the restoration of wetlands, dunes, mangroves, and all of that. So we would cultivate the natural environment as it is so that it acts as a natural buffer. And of course, institutional types of adaptation practices like mandating codes, building codes, urban planning reforms, and incentivizing any type of sustainable strategy, and of course, community-based preparedness, which is one of the most important things that could be underlooked when we're researching in the sense of engineering practices, because the community is the one that's going to be living in these areas. So we need to make sure that they have the right awareness, the right type of tools that they would actually want to have around that area if we're going to retrofit it or we're going to adapt it or apply any of the mitigation strategies. On the other hand, mitigation practices, while they do lead to the same thing, but they target the root cause of climate change. We said earlier that the root cause of climate change is increase in carbon dioxide emissions. So mitigation practices are any types of practices that target the reduction of carbon dioxide solely. So that could come from net zero buildings, sustainable transport, opting for electrical instead of any of the fossil fuel-based practices of renewable energy, of course. But research found that hybrid strategies, which is an integration of both adaptation and mitigation at the same time, or for instance, just under adaptation practices, to integrate more than two of them at the same time, creating a hybrid approach could reduce the flood risk by up to 40% by 2040. Instead of just like applying one of the things. And what we see in actually the Egyptian adaptation policies, and actually most of the adaptation policies now, because still the ball is still forming and it's still running, that they just focus on one of the strategies. They don't try to integrate it into a holistic approach. So As I mentioned, we have the existing policy in Egypt, which is Egypt's national climate change strategy, and we look at the gaps within the strategy itself. While it does tackle everything from a perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals based by the UN, however, there is a little bit of a lack of local enforcement when it comes to resiliency or when it comes to flood resiliency. Of course, we find that there are minimal nature-based solution integrations. We're focused mainly on the engineering structures and the defenses, and we already have poor infrastructure, so that needs upgrading and that needs retrofitting. And of course, there's a little bit of fragmented efforts where it needs to be more holistic and interdisciplinary. So the global practices that we look at, as we mentioned earlier, are the Netherlands, Japan, Bangladesh, and New York City. So in the Netherlands, they created an integrated hybrid system, and it's mainly under the scope of adaptation, where they wanted to make all the seawalls and integrate the nature-based solutions within them. So they created a holistic approach to tackling the flood risks. As you can see here, they started by layering and leveling the coast that they have control over and integrating the engineering structures at the end of it, and also enhancing the ecosystem and the wetlands and the nature-based solutions that that their environment provides. Followed by that, we find a developing country such as Bangladesh that don't necessarily have all of that financial support, if I could say that, for building all of these integrated hybrid approaches. So they opted for just nature-based solutions. So what they did is that they had a mangrove restoration and they started to enhance the ecosystem so it can act as a buffer, and they just elevated their structures so that the mangrove restoration can actually flourish and can act as an actual buffer. Followed by that, we have the multi-defense system and early warnings systems, which was based in Japan. However, this was highly integrated with technology. They used a lot of technology in order to achieve that because of their advancement in it. So it was easier for them to apply. That could be integrated in the current landscape. However, it could take longer time due to the technological advancement progress that we're at the moment. And finally, the New York City Coastal Resilience, which was named Rebuild by Design. It's a whole strategy that involves retrofitting. It involves a lot of things of like tackling the predicted coastal flooding in most of the districts of New York City. One of the things that they opted for is to actually use a nature-based solution, which is the leaves, but to create it and transform it into park so that the residents can actually utilize it. And they asked the community in order to drive the design process so that they can be finding their needs, and at the same time, they're doing something for the climate and they're trying to tackle a flood risk at the same time. However, it is a public area, so in the case of in the likelihood of a disaster or risk that hits, it could be closed off and no one can access it, and it'll still be functioning once everything tapers off. So based on the case study analysis, we draw some comparisons according to the adaptation strategy, the governance, the community role, and the nature-based solution scales and the innovative solutions, and we compare it to Alexandria. New York City was not involved in this case study analysis because it focuses on community, which is an important factor, but it's not it's necessary as a recommendation in general. So the adaptation strategy that we find for Netherlands was hybrid, just like we mentioned, so nature-based solutions and engineering. Bangladesh was mainly just focused on nature-based solutions. As for Japan, it had tech-driven seawalls and the heavy integration of technology as well. For Egypt or Alexandria specifically, it's a little bit fragmented when it comes to the nature-based solutions. However, engineering defenses are present and they are abundant around the area. As for governance, we have the binding coastal zone management plans for the Netherlands. We had localized policies for Bangladesh and national mandates in Japan. For Egypt, the local enforcement is still a little bit on its way to enforcing and implementing all of these adaptation strategies. The community role in the Netherlands was consultative, as well as in New York City. In Bangladesh, it was actually made for the community. And in Japan, it was a nationwide sort of drill. But as for Egypt, we still need to include the user in the conversation. So we do have minimal engagement when it comes to the community's opinion on design. As for the nature-based scale, in the Netherlands, it was extensive. In Bangladesh, it was the core strategy mainly. In Japan and Egypt, it's still minimal. Innovation, in Netherlands, it was real-time monitoring, and Bangladesh, it was low-tech solutions, but there wasn't really the innovative aspect of it was actually trying to use the available sources that they have to create an adaptation strategy. And for Japan, of course, it was the AI systems and technology. As for Egypt, we still need to incorporate more of the systems, the technological systems that can help us to actually realize when the risk might hit and how to mitigate it. Sorry. So from the case study analysis, we have a set benchmark, the international benchmark on adaptation processes and how they are implemented in order to combat coastal flooding. And we realized that in Alexandria specifically, we're doing great when it comes to the engineering and infrastructure aspect. However, when it comes to the nature-based or the institutional and policy coordination and community engagement, that still needs a lot of work. But of course, the main aspect here is monitoring and evaluation. We are yet to publish the National Adaptation Plan's strategy or progress, although it has been produced ever since 2011. So for coastal all of this information leads to what basically we're trying to create a guideline. When someone is trying to think of how can I combat flood, how can I create flood resilience in a vulnerable area, there could be a sort of guideline that could kind of focus on specific pillars that they can target. So holistically, it would all reduce the risk. So the integrated coastal adaptation and planning coordination is divided, or actually the Coastal Resilience Guideline is divided up into three main pillars. The policy and institutional measures. So you have policy into institutional coordination and climate integrated urban planning. You have zoning, building code enforcement, and funding incentives. This is policy-wise. As for infrastructure and building measures, you can upgrade the drainage systems, you can reinforce the existing infrastructure that is used as defense. You can elevate and flood-proof buildings, specifically when it comes to heritage sites or or critical infrastructure, and of course utilize smart systems in order to increase the impact of the overall infrastructure and building adaptation measures. As for the nature-based solutions, we can have wetland restoration, beach nourishment, and dune stabilization and urban green infrastructure. We could also add vegetative buffers. All of these pillars feed into, of course, the infrastructure and the building measures could take their opinion from community preparedness and participation so that they can be part of the planning and they can feel inclusive. So the inclusivity and the social impact that is embedded within the design process or the planning process would actually affect the overall outcome. And an additional thing or like bracket underneath the policy and institutional methods would be to actually mandate mitigation or emission reduction. So we can mandate energy efficiency for retrofitting for high-risk housing areas. We could install renewable energy such as solar panels and wind systems, and actually start integrating more green approaches. So all of these, or the five main pillars, they undergo monitoring and evaluation. And from the results of this monitoring and evaluation, it is a feedback loop. So it feeds into itself. So the guideline continues to be more relevant and get updated as time goes by. Okay, so as for the discussion, Alexandria's vulnerability, it stems from fragmented governance and the over-reliance on purely just one form of adaptation measure. And the global cases prove that hybrid approaches are they are attainable, we could do them and we can actually integrate them and we can incorporate the majority of them as well as create an actual flood reduction. And community engagement is critical for equitable resilience, such because due to the increased informal settlements that are actually underserved in the area of Alexandria. So the priority in the action, the timeline, the highest priority would be to use the institutional pillar to update the building codes for flood resilience. And this could occur within a time frame of just 2 years. The responsible agency would, of course, be the housing ministry. And the medium priority action would be to integrate more nature-based solutions. They're medium because of their time frame. They do require more time. However, the earlier we start, the better. And this, of course, is dependent on the Environment Agency. And the lowest part due to its time frame as well, because it does require a lot of time and updates and technology and advancement and incentives and financial incentives specifically, is flood sensors and early warning systems and the integration of technology. But with the rate of AI, I'm sure we're going to get there very soon. So in conclusion, Alexandria needs a holistic adaptive strategy, and there are a set of recommendations that we can achieve. You can start implementing to achieve that, which is adopting hybrid strategies, prioritizing community-led adaptation. We need to close these policy gaps with enforceable codes and real-time monitoring. We could embed climate resilience into urban planning frameworks and rating systems. We have the Green Pyramid rating system. It could actually be a foundation for that incentive, and finalize and implement the Egyptian national adaptation plans and scale up nature-based solutions for vulnerable areas specifically, while adding climate resilient architecture and green building practices. We need to develop more monitoring frameworks to track the adaptation projects, not just creating like the process and the frameworks to do it. And we need to mobilize climate finance through green bonds and adaptation funds, which Egypt has already been targeting since COP27, which was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, and that was actually the first time that funding for climate action was heavily emphasized. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?